Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we are going to continue down that list of the 50 best horror movies that you've never seen, with number 38 for us, but number 44 on the list, The Hunger. The Hunger came out in 1983 and was directed by Tony Scott and written by Ivan Davis and Michael Thomas. And this is considered a cult classic vampire film, and I believe it's the first vampire movie I've actually covered on my channel. Now, I'm not a huge fan of vampire movies. They tend to have more of a romantic plot line to them and kind of glamorize vampires. It's not so much the slasher gore horror that I like. It's more dialed down, more sophisticated, which isn't a bad thing. And I see that there are tons of avenues for vampire movies. There are tons of people who love that kind of romanticized version of horror, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just personally not my favorite. And I remember watching this movie on this list the first time I watched it and not really loving it. And upon my second rewatch, I confirmed that I don't really love it. Spoiler alert, I'm not a huge fan of this movie, but I can recognize it for the cinematic masterpiece that it's considered. I can recognize it for the acting, because the acting was really well done. They had a lot of really big name actors, and the musical score in this movie is gorgeous. The film as a film is a great piece. I'm just not a huge fan of the storyline, and it doesn't help that it's a romantic story based around vampires. But before we get into all of that, first let's go over the quick synopsis of the movie. Now, I read a couple of different articles, I read different summaries. I am not really sure what the actual plot is, in the sense of I'm not sure how the vampire's power works. And I say this because the movie starts in on our main vampire couple, Miriam, who is the woman, and then John, who is the man. John's actually played by David Bowie, and the female is Catherine Deneuve. She's a French actress, actually a very famous French actress, so I apologize that I'm probably not getting her name right. And we also see later in this movie Susan Sarandon, who is another huge star. So as I said, this movie has good actors behind it. But we go in on our main characters, Miriam and John, and we watch as they're in a nightclub. There's like a music playing. They get an actual band to play. The song they play is Bela Lugosi's Dead. So we're staying in that, horror atmosphere. But we watch as John and Miriam kind of attract couples to them. They take them back to their apartment in New York, and then they proceed to slit their throats and drain their blood, and then dump their bodies in an incinerator. And then the couple goes back to just sort of being like a well-off young couple that plays classical music and teaches it as their job. But John starts to age, and he's aging rapidly. He's got insomnia, he can't sleep, he's not as hungry as he used to be. And Miriam, whenever she transformed him into a vampire, this we sort of learn in the beginning, we sort of just learn it from listening to them speak to each other. We don't really get an actual backstory. But she tells him that drinking the blood of the youth will keep him alive forever. She fails to tell him that doesn't mean that he will be young forever. So John, who is now rapidly aging, like a year a minute almost, is panicking trying to find a solution. And he finds out about a Dr. Sarah Roberts, who is working on sort of turning back that internal clock. She does a lot of studies with monkeys and sort of rapidly aging them, and is hoping that if she can master rapidly aging, she can kind of bring it back and de-age people. She specializes on people who have that disease that causes you to age rapidly and has only a lifespan of 16 years. It's a very rare disease, but it is an actual thing that happens where basically your internal clock speeds up for kind of no reason and you rapidly age. A lot of kids will look like they'll be 8 or 9 years old and look like they're in their 70s. So she's working on sort of that de-aging process, which intrigues John, and he seeks her out to try to help him stop this de-aging. Sarah sort of blows him off at first, thinking he's just some other nut who's afraid to age, and then sees how rapidly he's aging in person, and then hunts him down, showing up at the house. Now, while she's hunting him down, Miriam and John are having their own confrontation as he's realizing that he's going to be like this forever and begging Miriam to put him out of his misery. To which she says that this is an eternal suffering that you have to put up with, basically. And as one final gesture to John, she very lovingly scoops up his frail old man body and takes him up to, I guess, her attic, where there are tons of just dust-covered coffins that have drapes over top of them. And she sets him in a coffin and says this word, these words, it's a poem or some shit. And then puts her with the other coffins and says oh, this is John, be nice to him, make his first night a good one. And you hear just moaning coming from the coffins. And then Sarah shows up at the door, and now Miriam no longer has her life partner, so she chooses Sarah to become her next partner, without really consulting Sarah about it. She invites her inside, they share a drink, they're talking, you know, they're both into music, into art, so they're getting along pretty well. And then Miriam slowly seduces Sarah, and during their sex scene, she bites Sarah and makes her drink her blood, and this, without Sarah realizing it, makes her, like, betrothed onto Miriam, essentially. Miriam keeps saying that, like, I own you, we're together forever now. So I guess consuming the blood of the vampire attaches you to them in this sort of way. So Sarah starts to get really sick. Her boyfriend notices and forces her to go get some blood work done, where they find out that there is alien blood in her bloodstream that's fighting with her blood cells. And so far it looks like she's not winning the fight. So Sarah is getting worse and worse and goes back to Miriam to confront her about what happened, to which Miriam sort of vaguely explains that she's now a vampire, doesn't really give her a straight answer. But she tells her that you can stay in my guest bedroom until the worst of the symptoms wear off. So Sarah goes up to the bedroom and is, like, profusely sweating and, like, convulsing and shaking. And they keep referring to her as being, like, ravenously hungry, but she can't eat because she wants blood. And then her boyfriend shows up at the house as he knows that she went to see Miriam the day before. And Miriam's like, oh yeah, she's just upstairs. So the boyfriend goes upstairs to look for Sarah, and then Sarah attacks and kills him. So now you're thinking, okay, maybe she's finally accepted that she's a vampire. Sarah comes downstairs, covered in her boyfriend's blood, still kind of shaky and a little bit disoriented, and Miriam's like, oh, it gets better. It's crazy how easy it is, isn't it? And as they kind of, like, start to embrace, Sarah sort of letting Miriam on to believe that she's accepting of this vampire ways, Sarah takes the necklace that Miriam wears, which is an Egyptian pendant of life. It's called the Ankh pendant. It's one that, I'll put it up on the screen. It's one that, like, I'm sure you've seen other places. It's a very big Egyptian hieroglyphic symbol, and it just symbolizes eternal life. And this is a pendant that Miriam wears throughout the entire movie, and she pops off the top of it to reveal a knife, and that's how she slits the throat of her victims to drink. But while they're in this embrace, Sarah pops off the top of the knife without Miriam noticing, and Sarah stabs her own throat, forcing Miriam to consume her blood. And then as she drops to the floor, Miriam's, like, holding her neck, and Sarah's like, no, let it happen. And she, like, moves her hand away from her neck so she's gushing blood. And Miriam is, like, sobbing and carrying her up to the attic to join her with the other corpses that she keeps up there. And as she's, like, performing her little ritual, putting Sarah into the coffin, all the corpses start to, like, really get loud and disruptive because they're not actually dead people. They're just super, super old bodies with, like, eternal souls trapped in them. So the bodies are useless. They're like dust. They're like mummies, essentially. And they all start popping out of their coffins and attacking Miriam, and then they cause her to fall down the balcony, and she lands, like, all the way on the ground. And she starts to rapidly age as well, and she's, like, throwing a fit, and all the mummies are, like, watching over her, basically, like, seeking the revenge. Because you can only assume, based on what happened with Sarah and what happened with John, that these are all past lovers who can't die, but their bodies are no longer useful, so she just, like, sticks them in a box and puts them up somewhere. So Miriam's body is now completely decomposed, and we assume that she is as dead as a vampire can get in this scenario. Sarah's body is just laying on the ground, lifeless, and the scene, like, fades to black and then comes back in, and the apartment's now empty. A realtor is trying to sell it to someone, and that's when we found out that, like, they sort of just died and all their stuff got donated, and they really don't give you a good explanation as to, like, what happened to the bodies. And then we just see Sarah in a completely different city, like, looking out on her balcony at her, like, little apartment, and this woman comes up and kisses her and walks away. And, like, she has, like, a mark on her neck where you can see where the stab was. And then it fades to black. Okay, so now let's talk about that, because I read a lot of articles. I watched some interviews. I watched a little documentary. I watched the part of the 50 Best Horror Movies that talks about this movie. Every single thing gave you a different reason for why this vampire does what she does. The whole story plot is different depending on what article you're looking at or who you're talking to, because there are so little answers given. Now, before I kind of rag on that, because that's going to be a big part of this video, it's just me not understanding the story. I could just be not understanding it. That's totally fine. I think I get what the underlying message is, that dying is not what's scary, it's getting old. John focuses a lot on getting old and how awful that is and how he wanted to be young forever. So there's really, really heavy themes on sort of immortality and just, would you live forever if that meant that your body couldn't stay the way it was. And they refer to it a lot as like being an addict, because being a vampire is a lot like being an addict. You have to have the blood in order to stay youthful and young, or else your body ages to a point where you're no longer useful and your soul's just trapped in a useless body. And topics of immortality aren't new. We've seen that time and time again, not even in horror movies, just in philosophy and art in general, talk a lot about immortality. So the topic itself isn't hard to understand. It just felt like a lot of that was so rushed, and we didn't really get an explanation as to how these people live forever. So it's kind of hard to say that this is even a movie about immortality until like the end of the movie, and you sort of get the idea. But if that's what makes people happy and that's what people want to focus on, then like sure, that's fine. I don't care about that. This movie also, a lot of the summaries describe it as a love triangle, which that in of itself is just something I'm not interested in. I'm not a romantic person. A lot of the reason I don't like a lot of vampire stuff is because it is so heavily based in romance. There's always some type of romance story, which just is not that compelling to me. And I'm not really sure when vampires became like the sexy horror figures, but like I could give or take it. I think vampires are a cool concept. I think they're a cool monster, but they're so overly sexualized at this point that I'm not interested in them anymore. I could probably name on one hand the amount of like vampire related things I enjoy, and it's not even that much. I'm just not a vampire person. But this movie is considered a cult classic, and big vampire fans love this movie. And Tony Scott's directing style throughout this movie is very beautiful. As I said earlier, cinematically, this is a gorgeous film. He was very inspired by a fashion photographer in the way that they kind of have like the silky, billowing, airy lightness to some of their photos. He really incorporated that. There's so much silk and curtain action happening in this movie. So it feels a lot like an artistic piece, and there's a really heavy undertone to it with the whole immortality thing. So the movie itself just feels artistically heavy to me, and it's a hard thing to explain, and I'm not sure if I'm getting that across correctly, but it just feels like a lot of very heavy topics shot in this very dramatic, beautiful way with this gorgeous instrumental score. The music in this film is just fantastic. It's like beautiful symphony pieces. There's piano, there's like cello, violin. It's just gorgeous. I love all of the elements to the movie. It's just a story I don't care about. But as I said, there are so many different variations to what the story is to this movie, and basically how I interpret this movie. So this is totally up to interpretation. I'd love to know what you guys think and how you think the vampire-ness works in this film. But Miriam is an ancient Egypt goddess from 6,000 years ago who is basically a vampire. That's why she has a little pendant she wears with the knife attached to it, which she uses to slit her victims' throats. And Miriam seeks out companions. She doesn't want to be lonely. She always wants to have someone with her. So she will infect another person, I'm presuming by making them drink her blood based on what we saw with her and Sarah, and they will become her lover, where they will just travel and eat people together for hundreds of years. But, and what I don't understand is why suddenly they age, because she doesn't. And it could be because she's a goddess and she's not supposed to age. One thing I read said it happens every 100 years. Her lovers just start to rapidly age and she can't do anything about it. Another source I read said that when she's done with them, that she will break the spell and they'll start to age. Because consuming the blood keeps you living forever. It just doesn't stop you from aging. So we don't know why they don't age. They don't really explain that. And they don't explain why suddenly John's character is just aging rapidly for no reason, and Miriam seems really distraught about it. But then you find out that she's got like all her other lovers saved away in boxes. So you're only assuming that she knows what's going to happen, so you have to assume that she's a part of it. And the whole time she kind of gives like a sinister, like, I know something you don't kind of vibe to her. So you know that she is the cause for these people slowly deteriorating after a certain amount of time, but we don't really know why. And because they teach classical music, one of their students, Alice, who had taken a really big liking to Miriam, it's assumed that Alice, who's a teenager in the movie, is being groomed by Miriam. So whenever she's done with John, she can then have Alice take his place as her like companion. And when Miriam does take John up to the other coffin, she does seem genuinely upset that she can't release him from the agony that he's in. So she does have this sense of she does love the people that she makes her companions, and does feel, I guess, remorse for not being able to truly relieve them of their pain. But she still goes around and does it. So I don't really know how much I'm gonna sympathize with her character. But that's the biggest confusing factor to this movie, is I'm not really sure how the vampiring works, and they don't explain it. And apparently no one else really knows either, because everything I read sort of says something different. Even Susan Sarandon had said in later interviews that she wasn't really exactly sure how the magic worked for these vampires. And the ending itself is very bizarre, because as Susan has said in interviews, the ending was supposed to end with her character dying, Miriam decaying away, all of the corpses finally sort of just collapsing, released. Now that Miriam is dead, they're able to have their souls released. Sarah is dead now too. And then it cuts to the real estate agent talking about how they died and now the house is available for sale, and Sarah's in a different country, perfectly alive and healthy. And Sarah's character was supposed to have a realization, which you do sort of get the feel of, especially as her last dying words were, "No, let this happen." She's realizing that this life means basically living as an addict, continuously having to kill humans to drink their blood to stay alive forever, or she can end things now, which is what she chose to do. Her character was supposed to completely die off, kind of ending Miriam's reign of power as well, because they swapped the blood, and now that Susan's dead, Miriam will die, and then all the souls from the dead corpses will die as well. But because everything is a cash grab, they wanted to have an ending that allowed for a sequel, which is why we show Sarah's character still alive in a different city. No sequel was ever made. As of August 2020, there is no sign of a sequel being made. So they tacked on this ending to a movie that made it even more confusing than it needed to be. But I at least appreciate that the character of Sarah was trying to sort of end the reign of power Miriam had done, and that she chose, instead of living life as an addict and never really settling anywhere, she chose to end her life in that very moment, which I think is admirable. I'm just such at a loss with this movie because I'm not a big vampire person. So it's hard for me to watch vampire movies without already sort of disliking them. But I tried to put that part of my brain away while watching this movie, and it really feels more like a romance film than a horror film to me. It feels even more like it would be kind of like a romantic alternative film, because there is a little bit of blood. The corpses at the end are scary as they hover over her and she's rapidly aging. That part is scary. There are suspenseful, uneasy moments throughout the film, but I don't think it's enough to really be scary for me. Honestly, other than having huge names and being considered a vampire cult classic, I'm not sure why this movie's on the list. But everyone who I saw talk about this movie loves this movie. It has a huge following, especially in the vampire community. But the only things that redeem it for me are just the cinematics of it, the way that it was shot and the music and stuff like that. But that's not enough for me to want to watch it again if I can't sit through the story. And just there's so many zoom ins and quick shots and a lot of artistic shots, which can be really great, but they don't do well when it comes to setting a scene or really helping you understand what's happening. A lot of quick cuts and zoom ins can make it really disorienting, and that's kind of how the beginning felt. And there's a couple of scenes just thrown throughout this movie that have those quick cuts and zoom-ins and edits, and they're very dramatic and beautifully shot, but it doesn't make sense as far as the story goes, and it gets really confusing. It could just totally be me. I could be horribly misinterpreting this entire thing, and if that's the case, I do apologize. But I don't know, honestly, it just doesn't feel like that good of a story to me, and it definitely does not feel like a horror story. I do want to give a little shout out to Dick Smith, though. He was the makeup special effects artist on scene, because the corpses look great. The effects, while there aren't a ton of effects in this movie, they are well done. And that's not surprising because Dick Smith also did the movie The Exorcist, and we know how badass that makeup was. So, shouts out to him. He did make this movie a little bit more the grotesque that I would like, but it's a vampire movie, so I didn't get any of that. So I will give him a little shout out, because he, even though there wasn't a ton of horror and gore in this movie, he did at least a good job for the parts that he was a part of. But this could just be a movie that is meant to be up for interpretation and isn't supposed to have sort of one way of looking at it. It's a very artistic film, which wouldn't surprise me if it was supposed to have an artistic message behind it. I do like the idea of the eternal afterlife and the idea of choosing not to live as an addict like Sarah chose, although they brought her back for whatever reason. So in that case, I do enjoy the movie, but it's definitely not one I'm gonna watch again. It frustrated me too much. There's a lot of just like overly done love scenes. There's a lot of sex scenes. There's like a huge lesbian sex scene in the middle of this movie, which every critic loved that I read. Everyone loved that these two, Catherine and Susan, got to have this scene together. Their chemistry on film is amazing, and that scene is beautiful. But it's vampires, and vampires always have a sex scene because vampires are constantly horny for whatever reason. But yeah, I can't give this one a full unbiased opinion just because I'm not really into vampires. I personally don't think it deserves to be on the list just because it doesn't seem like a horror movie, especially compared to all the other movies on this list. This one seems very dialed back, and it is almost more romantic and dramatic than anything else, which to me just doesn't make it feel like it fits. And if I was to give this movie a gore rating, I would say it's probably just gorgeous. Overall, there's a little bit of blood. It's not a lot. The mummies were cool, but we don't get a lot of like gore. And it's crazy to me that a vampire movie wouldn't have that much gore, but whatever. We got to see some blood. They showed a couple of throats getting slit open, so I'll give them that. But if you guys have watched this movie, I would love to know what you think, especially about how you interpreted the vampiringness of it all and how Miriam's powers sort of transfer from victim to victim. You can leave a comment down below or head over to my Instagram, What a Horror. I'll be making a post about this video as well. But as always, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos. I put out new videos every Friday. And until next time, stay spooky.